What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Welcome back to Truth Be Told, where we believe an experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and I'm here with world-renowned psychic Eddie Connor and the wonderful guest co-host, 8-time Emmy-winning investigative reporter, Anna Garcia.
Hi, Tony, and hi, Eddie. We thank you for supporting our sponsors. For over 40 years, Earth-Friendly Products have brought you the greenest home products for all your family needs. Go to ecos.com.
And while you're at it, you can travel right on over to Adventures Unlimited Press to purchase books from many of our famed experts featured right here on Truth Be Told.
And, you know, some of us, such as myself and Eddie, I'm not sure about Anna, but some of us had the opportunity to actually see a UFO, while others have only heard stories about these unidentified flying objects that have hovered the planet. Well, tonight's guest, I am so excited that he's been tracking UFOs since the 1970s, almost 40 years ago, so we're excited to have him on the show.
Grant Cameron became involved in ufology as the Vietnam War ended in May of 1975. There, Cameron witnessed personal sightings of a UFO-type object, which was locally became known as Charlie Red Star. These sightings occurred 25 miles north of the Canadian and U.S. border, and the story has now been opted for a movie that will be released in 2016.
And to answer your question, no, I've not seen a UFO. But these sightings led to a decade of research into the early work done by the Canadian government and flying saucer phenomena. Both Cameron and Wilbert B. Smith quickly became leaders and authorities in government programs. From here, Cameron did 2 decades of research into the role of the President of the United States and our country's UFO mysteries. Most of that research can be found at presidentialufo.com.
Cameron also co-authored books on the government's UFO cover-up titled UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government, along with UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informants. Grant also released the Alien Bedtime Storybook and is also preparing to release Inspirations and Downloads, Where Good Ideas Come From.
Please help us welcome author, ufologist, and researcher Grant Cameron. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Well, thank you, Tony. That's quite the send-off you got there.
And it's over. No, just kidding. So
wonderful.
Well, first of all, we were, like I said in the intro, Eddie and I have seen UFOs. Anna is the lone one in the room that has not. But I want to tell our listening and viewing audience your encounter of a UFO.
My first encounter was in May of 1975. It was about 2 weeks after the end of the Vietnam War. And I had no interest in UFOs that I can think of. I was interested in near-death experiences. I was interested in Edgar Cayce and stuff like that. But the only reason I actually got involved in Carmen, which is outside the major city that I live in here in Manitoba, which is Winnipeg. It's about small town, had these sightings going on starting in February of 1975. And I told my friends, we used to drive around the city and do nothing, just sort of drive around. And I said, why don't we go out to Carmen and see what these people are looking at? And my friend said, okay, yeah, we'll go. And we never did go. And it was not until 3 months later, and looking back on it now, I think it was actually a setup that they dragged me out there because what happened was in May of 1975, there was some local TV crews, one from the biggest private network in Canada and one from the government network. They were trying to film this thing because it was being seen, all reports were coming out. And the local private affiliate here, CKY TV, actually caught this thing on the ground. There's about 10 people involved in this, and they sort of surrounded it from 2 sides.
Grant,
And as
we're missing
yeah.
every few words with you.
Yeah, we're
Do you have
cutting out
call
just-
waiting,
yeah,
or is there a
you're-
problem?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're cutting out as well.
Oh,
So
I
really?
don't
We
know
haven't
what the
said
deal is.
anything.
Yeah, in your intro you were cutting out. So
Oh,
Oh,
really?
okay. Oh,
Okay, it's
okay.
those pesky UFOs again.
I think
okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're trying to keep us from
They
the
are. The
information.
aliens are not letting us talk to
I
you.
think it's the government, not the aliens.
Okay,
okay,
there you
there we
go.
go. Okay.
well, if it gets bad enough, you can always send me another call and see if we get a better line or a
Okay.
better.
We'll
All right.
keep going
Thanks,
and see
Grant.
how it works.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, they had this thing on the ground, and one of the cars was there. It was a object about 50 feet high. It was not touching the ground, but it was like a movie screen. It was sort of on an angle, not sitting on the ground behind these set of trees. The guys in the car were getting their bearings of various microwave towers around them. And as they did, this thing jumped in the air. They didn't realize it. They were looking around. They couldn't figure out where this thing had gone. They figured it disappeared. And the camera, which was about 8.25 miles away, a big TV camera, actually was filming as this thing jumped up in the air. And this film became very, it almost went viral. NBC picked it up. It was all over the world. People were talking about it. And when that happened, that's when I said to my friends, "Come on, let's go see what they're looking at." And I've always described it as you buy a lottery ticket, you know there's a chance you can win, but you know you're not going to win. And that's the way I felt when I went out. I figured, well, everybody else sees it. When we show up, it won't show up. And we were there for about an hour. We drove in this town, out of the town, in the town, out, and in and out. And after an hour, my friend Larry, who was driving, said, well, we're going to drive back in town one more time, and if we don't see anything, we'll go home. I said, fine with me. This has been a total waste of time. And so we were driving into town, and just as we started into town, it came from the left to the right. It came from the direction of the U.S. border, moving from south to north, right in front of the car, down very low. It was not a light in the sky. It was an object. It was, people have asked me to describe it, and it's basically looked like it was alive. It looked like a beating heart. It was like a plasma type UFO craft. You couldn't see the actual shape of it because it was the light around it was so intense. And it was moving very, very slow. I would say no more than 20, 30 miles an hour, very low to the ground, sort of bobbing up and down. It wasn't flying in a straight line. And it was going in behind a set of school buses outside the town. And I can still remember getting out of the car. I was so excited. I was getting out of the car as the car was still moving because I wanted to get across this parking lot and get to the school buses so I could watch this thing because I knew it was going to get in behind the school buses. That was my first encounter, and I was totally blown away. I dragged all my friends out there 2 nights later. And they all disappeared an hour later saying, we're hungry. We're going back to Winnipeg for pizza. This is a waste of time. They took off, and 15 minutes after they took off, the second night, the thing was what you'll sometimes hear described in ufology. We called it the bouncing ping pong ball. It was like a flash cube, and it was sort of bouncing around in the sky. Huge movements in the sky. And I taken some kids who were doing science fair projects, 13, 14-year-old kids there, and they said, "Is that what it is?" And I went, "I guess so." It didn't look like the first night, but as it came closer to us, it was coming right at us. As it came closer, it turned into this object I had seen the first night. And I remember that night, as it came right towards us and then made sort of a slight turn and headed northeast around the town. I can still remember looking at this thing with this red and this sort of a green glow on the backside of it, thinking, "Wow! I mean, this might be somebody from another planet." And I was just totally amazed with this, and that started my sort of search to go and talk to the people in the town because I knew that, like when I did the poll at the high school, that 59% of the kids in the high school said they'd seen this thing. It was a very high percentage of people in this town that were involved in this thing, even though nobody wanted to talk about it. And so I would interview people, and then they would say, "Well, how did you find out about me?" And then I would say, "Well, so-and-so told me you'd seen something." Then they would tell me their whole story, and then they would say, "I was the only one that saw it," and then they would give you 5 names. And at one point, I had like 300 people on a list of people I hadn't even interviewed yet. Wow. So I did all the interviews, and I talked to all the people and gathered some photographs that have been taken, and tried to publish a book, which never really did get published. And the local publisher who should have published it, because it was a very famous encounter here, all the stories everybody knew about it, said, "Mr. Cameron, you may believe on this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers." And it was at that point I said, "This sighting stuff's a total waste of time. This is nonsense." And all I was interested in but this would be about 1977. All I was interested in was finding out what I had seen. And I figured there had to be somebody in the world that knew the answer to what I had seen. So that's when I started looking to high-level authorities to try to figure out who had the documents, who had the information to find out what was it that I had seen. I figured someone had to know, and I started this pursuit where I first went to the Canadian government, because my father had actually worked for the department that was investigating UFOs, even though my father wasn't involved. But somebody in my father's office had said, well, if you want to know about UFOs, you should know about Wilbur Smith. I used to work for him. And he used to talk to aliens and they landed in his backyard. And I went, what are you talking about? And so I started this search. I went to the Canadian government, researched this whole thing. And that led me to the former president of Penn State University, who indicated that he had been at a set of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1950. And this guy had 14 honorary doctorate degrees. He was the chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, the co-developer of the Horving torpedo, very close friends with Vannevar Bush and President Eisenhower, and very, very powerful guy. And he sort of played rhymes and riddles with us for 8 years. I was sort of leading a team of about maybe 6 or 7 investigators around the world who said, I can get him to talk. And I would give him the phone number. And so what we did is when we published this first book, UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government, what we basically did is took all the stuff that Walker had said to us in transcripts, in interviews, well, not interviews, because he really wasn't being interviewed. He was just talking on the phone and couldn't hang up the phone. And letters that he had sort of sent back with little cryptic messages and stuff. And we just put it all in a book and did the whole thing. And he was going to leave his files. He was the executive director of the Research and Development Board in 1950, which is basically like an assistant secretary of defense in charge of weapons. And he had indicated that he might leave those files to the Truman Library. And that's why I went to the Truman Library. And it was when I got there, I couldn't find anything on Walker except for a few little documents and stuff. I suddenly decided, well, I mean, if I'm looking for an answer, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. What does the most powerful person in the world know about UFOs? And that's when I asked the Truman Library, I said, what have you got on UFOs? And they said, well, we've got these, if you remember back in 1952, there was these overflights of the Capitol and the White House,
Yep.
two different nights in July of 1952. And during that period, the story was put out in newspapers around America that President Truman had given a shoot-down order. And so in the presidential library were all these telegrams to the president from various people in the United States saying, don't shoot him down, Mr. President. Please don't shoot him down. And that was basically all they had. And then I'm thinking, well, that's kind of weird. And I went down the road about 100 miles to the Eisenhower Library, which is in Abilene, Kansas, and very close. And there I actually did an interview with, you have to interview to be allowed to research there. And so they asked all these questions, and I said, well, I want the UFO files. And they had 28 million pages of files, and they only had 5 documents on UFOs. One was the famous CIA Robertson panel report, but there was nothing. And so 5 documents, and I'm thinking, well, something's wrong here. The president's got to know what's going on. There's got to be something. And that started this 20-year search to go and to all the libraries and to find out which presidents knew, which ones that had sightings, and where the answer lay. And after that sort of pursuit, I got twisted around again in that I watched a lecture by Colin Anders, and this happened February 26th, 2012, where I get a download experience, what I call, and Edgar Mitchell described his download experience when he comes back to Earth. And it's basically an experience where you're sitting in a room, your mind is sort of wandering, and all of a sudden, just a pile of material all comes into your head instantaneously. Great excitement comes with this, and absolute certainty. This is something I cannot explain to people. It's absolute certainty that this answer is right. And it was at that moment I was downloaded the idea with various things that had happened in the UFO, just with documents and stuff that suddenly came into my head that indicated that the basis of the UFO phenomena is all got to do with consciousness. That's where you have to look at consciousness. And when I started down that road in 2012, everything started to fit together. All the pieces started to fit together. And that's the road I'm on right now, is working on related stuff like the cure to cancer, cure to Alzheimer's, some of the stuff that's around that really isn't talked about, that has to do with consciousness, how the brain works, how the mind works, and how all phenomena, whether you're talking psychic phenomena, whether you're talking ghosts, whether you're talking psychedelic experiences, channeling, UFO experiences, are all basically experiences where the left brain is basically put to sleep, or like the chatter is quietened down, and the right brain is allowed to access, the non-local right brain is allowed to access the universe and gather up all this material. So that's the pursuit I'm on now, is this whole thing about where good ideas come from, where inventions come from, what happens when people are abducted, are aliens right brain, left brain, how do aliens work, how do they cure people, how do they put in implants without leaving scars? And a lot of these answers are very evident when you look at and understand this concept of consciousness.
Well, I think it's fascinating, Grant, that you initially started out exploring and being interested in near-death experiences and some Edgar Cayce.
Yeah.
And then this came around with the UFOs, and then you did all of your exploration with that, and then it sort of came back around to where you started out.
Yeah,
With
it's full circle.
Evolved consciousness. So the out-of-body experiences and the channeling and that sort of thing, do you think of that more as a right brain thing or a whole brain thing once you can rest the left brain?
Well, the way I interpret it is the way science describes, you have a consciousness it's like a light bulb, and it gives off light, which is consciousness, and it's a unified thing. Actually, when you look at and you start to understand that we actually have two brains, we have two brains that are connected by a corpus callosum. And we discovered in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when they started to cut the corpus callosum to stop epilepsy, that you actually have two brains which are totally different. They fight with each other. One can speak, one can't speak. Very, very different. And the further research that was shown working with these split brain people is that in the left side of the brain you have what's called they call it an interpreter or a storyteller. It's another completely different type of consciousness that works independently. And the latest research, if you take a look at, in 1981, Nobel Prize was given for this split brain research. The guy that continued it on was Dr. Michael Gazzaniga. And Gazzaniga was the guy that started to ask questions of the various brains and run these very bizarre experiments that showed what is actually going on. And he says there are dozens, if not thousands, of modules in each side of the brain. So this is the new model that I use, is that we say, when people say you have you're using your mind or your brain, no, you have literally potentially thousands of different consciousnesses, like your verbal center, your visual center. These things all work independently, and so the brain is not this one unified thing, which is like an epiphenomena. It's a very, very complex thing where something's putting this all together. So what I say is that the left brain is you have consciousness as it is, like across the universe, this very complex thing that is all reality, and you have a conscious mind on top of it, and that is given to us. You need this left brain ego mind that is allows you to exist in the physical world. But once you can block off that conscious mind and go into whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it the unconscious mind, the matrix, or whatever you want to call it, that's the thing, is to get out of the conscious mind, which is basically like a filter. If you look at Aldous Huxley talked about the fact that it filters down consciousness to a very like 1% of consciousness, so that you're able to survive in the physical world. You don't need the rest of the consciousness. And that's what psychics can do and channelers can do, is they can break that filter. Or if you take a look, I do a lot of work with autistic people, these people who are able to do calendar counting, or who are able to play any kind of music. They can play music they've never heard before, and do mathematical stuff like, multiply 6-digit numbers against each other. These autistic people, they all have left brain damage. So whether you're using a psychedelic drug to break that filter, whether you're using autism, or whether you're using channeling or meditation or drumming or whatever it is, it's that idea that if you can get out of the physical mind, the conscious ego mind, then you can tap into all these bizarre phenomena that we say, don't exist. And they do exist. They're just outside of the reality that we're used to, because we're imposed with this conscious mind that we need in order to exist in a physical world.
So I am an intuitive, and I know about conscious channeling, which is what I do when I do readings, closing my eyes and summoning that energy, and then sort of putting to sleep a little bit of the left brain, just enough so I'm cognizant, and then downloading whatever information that person's soul or their higher self, their pure essence. And I'm a firm believer that we're literally 0.01% physical on this planet, and that our true self is 99.99% non-physical or pure positive energy. And so what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it correctly, that Well, I'm hearing two things. Number one is we all talk about angels and spirit guides and that
Yep.
sort of thing, and how we have access to these, quote, multidimensional consciousnesses.
Yeah.
And then, but a lot of times people don't want to talk about the multidimensional extraterrestrial type beings from other parts of the universe as well. Is that what you're saying?
I think all of, whether you're talking extraterrestrials or spirit guides or these, they live in this type of world. They're living in this non-physical sort of whatever you want to call it, different vibrations or whatever.
Yes.
And so if an alien, like some of the alien descriptions through the experiencers, who I think are the most important people in the world, they will actually say that they are like spirit, like you'll get these orb type things where an alien will appear in an orb and then appear in a physical form, that they can move from this world of dreams of apparently non-physical, and they can manifest themselves in a physical world in order to talk to us, but they aren't actually physical. They can move between the different environments, whereas we're stuck in this one level, and we can just sort of use our mind to move into their world. And a lot of experiencer type stuff will say, people will say, I thought it was a dream, and then the aliens will say, that's our world. That's why we talk to you in dreams, because now you're in our world. So it's that idea that they're outside this thing, and it's the ability to tap into, whether it's a spirit guide or whatever it is, and it's almost the same as the brain, where it would have these thousands of modules. I'm a firm believer what Thomas Edison said, that we don't understand 1/1,000,000th of 1% about anything. That when you start looking at the levels of reality that are outside our conscious mind, it's just like probably limitless. And I sort of believe what David Bohm says. We always in the world, we always want to sort of put a period on everything, like as if we understand everything. We've come to the end. We just got to do a couple more decimal places and we've got everything figured out. And what people say is, well, now we're at the quantum world, and once we understand the quantum physics and the quantum world, we'll understand everything. We'll be able to fit it all together. And I'm a firm believer in what David Bohm, the guy that came up with the holographic universe idea, said. He said, no, when you get to the bottom of the quantum world and you figure that all out, you get below there, you're going to suddenly find another level of reality, totally. And below that, another one. And I believe that's probably what the universe is going to be like. It's going to be so multidimensional. It's even like consciousness itself. Like sometimes you'll see written the fact that in the visual world, we see only one hundredth of 1% of what there is.
Yeah.
And that's not true. It's the same with consciousness.
Yeah.
If you take a look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it is infinite in both directions. So the little piece of visible spectrum that we see is literally zero. If you say that it's infinite in all directions, just this little bit, and the consciousness would be the same thing. And that's the problem we have with the scientific world, is consciousness is saying there's just one consciousness, and you have a brain, you have a consciousness, and that's all it is. Once you start saying, well, you have all these other aspects of consciousness, then they'll fight with you and they'll say, no, it's almost back the way we were in 1800, when we believed that the only thing that existed is what we could see, because we couldn't measure radio waves and X-rays and stuff. And once we started to measure it, we suddenly realized we were only seeing a small spectrum. I believe the same thing happens with consciousness, is that we're saying we see all of consciousness. It's all that we experience in the physical world. And I'm saying absolutely not. When you get down to what it's all about, I believe it's going to be, you're seeing nothing of the consciousness that actually exists.
I remember hearing an interview that you did, and you were talking about telepathy with aliens. What do you think telepathy with the UFO aliens? What do you think is more left or right brain? Because I really don't know. I mean, because
absolutely right, absolutely right. If you look at somebody, if you want to bring somebody really interesting on your show, you should have Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell. Are you familiar with her research?
Yes,
I'm not, but Eddie is.
Yeah,
I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
She has what's called the Telepathy Project, and she's actually been picked up now by Deepak Chopra. Has
wow.
Given her approval to put in a proposal to his foundation, and he's going to finance her research. She works the same as I'm very interested in autistic people, because they have these very bizarre abilities, like savants, like the guy, the Rain Man, the famous Rain Man.
Right.
The movie was.
Yep.
He had memorized 12,000 books, and he could go forwards and backwards. He could read 2 pages at the same time, one with one eye, one with the other eye. I mean, some of these abilities. So she started looking at these autistic people, and what she has is, if you look at, it's called the Telepathy Project on her website, you will see she has this girl by the name of Haley, and there's a bunch of these around. I've actually tried to contact the reporters dealing with one in the United Emirates, and what Haley is she's a nine-year-old now. I guess she's 10. She's in America somewhere, and Diane Hennessy Powell puts these videos of her research with this girl. And this girl she's a nonverbal autistic, which means she has left brain damage. And all autistics, all savants have left brain damage. And it's either comes from birth or it comes from injuries, like Edgar Cayce, for example,
Yes.
got hit with a baseball.
Yep.
Some of the great psychics, the one that there was, Hirkos fell off a ladder and hit his head. You'll get these brain injuries where suddenly the person becomes very psychic or whatever. So Haley, this one that Diane Hennessy Powell is featured on her videos, was at the time 9 years old. She was nonverbal, which means her left brain audio speaking center was totally shut down. She couldn't talk, but now you can talk to these people because you can use keypads and stuff. So what they show with her is she was first picked up by one of her therapists who believed that Haley was reading her mind. So she said to Haley in her mind, she said, "Haley, how do you say I love you in German?" And this Haley punched this into to her keypad and exactly the German phrase. And this girl can do foreign languages. And so she contacted Diane Powell, and she said, "This girl, I believe, is reading my mind." So Diane goes down and does these experiments with this girl. And at one point, she shows the video of 18 numbers where she's doing telepathy, and this is like alien telepathy, pure telepathy, where she's basically picking off when you can calm her down. Like most times she's flipping out and having tantrums and stuff like that. But when you can calm her down and get her focused, then she does this. And on the video, she does these mathematical things where she's getting tired of telepathy. So they actually say, "We're going to give you mathematical stuff. You have to multiply one against the other and give us the answer."
Oh.
And so it's an actual equation that this girl's picking up. And the one that's shown on the video, she shows 18 numbers. But at one point, Haley gets 162 numbers in a row right.
Wow.
So this is like alien telepathy. Because when people have telepathy with aliens, I always say, did you understand what the alien said? Did you understand, or did you sort of understand, or was it like pure words coming through? And they said, well, it wasn't words, but I knew exactly what he was saying. There is no noise in the signal. And our type of telepathy, that's the problem, is the conscious mind is creating the noise in the signal.
Yeah.
The signal is a telepathy. The conscious mind creates the noise, and the idea is to figure a way to block the noise to get the pure signal. So autistics have the left brain. They have so much damage in the left brain that you can actually there's no noise signal whatsoever. The same as at the University of Sydney in Australia. They actually prove that you can do this, and what they do is they take the left hemisphere and they stimulate it magnetically, and these people suddenly become autistic. They'll say to them, "Draw a cat," and the person will draw a cat, and as they're stimulating the brain, suddenly the cat gets better, and they draw it again and again, and suddenly they're almost like they're autistic. They can do drawings that they could never do before, and that's just by magnetically stimulating, shutting down this left hemisphere. So I would say aliens are extremely right-brained. They're in that non-conscious element where they can sort of block out the conscious mind, or however it's done. I'm not sure exactly how it's done, but I would say definitely very right-brained.
How much? So we're talking about Haley, and we're talking about these mathematical equations and how she speaks these different languages, and she's able to get that through a download, as it were. Isn't everything you just mentioned a left brain thing, and aren't autistic children, as you just described, they have left brain damage? So on top of the left brain damage, she's still receiving the download. Are you saying she's receiving the download with the right brain and still able to pick up? So I've got a question then. What would happen if you guys were working with Haley and working with her with images and paintings and things like that that are more high frequency, and then incorporating feeling and emotion in it? Because what I'm picking up here, Grant, is that it's a feeling that comes with the download more than it is anything cerebral. And it feels like the more colors and images and pictures and good feelings, high frequency feelings, wealth, rich, enhanced artistic creative expression, music, tones, harmonics, I feel like then the outcome that you would get with Haley would be even greater than what she's already doing.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would be up to Diane as to where she's going. She's just trying to prove the fact that
Oh.
this girl's telepathic. And she's run up against a thing where she did all this experimental work, and then of course the skeptic said, "Well, you
course.
can't prove there wasn't a machine in there prompting her." But if you're talking like images,
Yeah.
again, you're talking music. You're talking
Yeah.
we know from neurology that the right brain sees in images. Like,
Yeah.
for example, remote viewing. What you do in remote viewing, if you listen to Joe McMoneagle, he says, and he's the best there is, and he can do the out-of-body remote viewing. He's the highest percentage, and he says you have to leave behind the left brain ego. You have to shut that down, and he sees everything in images. So when you're doing a remote viewing, what you do is you have to cut out the left brain stuff, like the numbers. So all they do is they give you a target, and it has to be a blind target. If I say to you, for example, here's our remote viewing target, and it's from Egypt, what's going to happen is your left brain interpreter is going to suddenly say, I know what it is. It's the King's Chamber and the pyramid. It's going to start guessing. So when you're doing remote viewing, you have to cut out that left brain. You have to use the right brain. And what they say in remote viewing is just say what you're feeling. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you taste? That's all right brain type stuff.
Yeah.
And do not guess what it is. Once you guess, you're using the left brain. You're using the analytical, rational left brain. And once you do that, the remote viewing is over. You have to stay in the right brain, the images, the taste, the feel, the here and the now. The left brain is in the past and the future. The here and now, if you just describe, and most artists are right brained.
Yes.
Most abductees are right brained.
And most psychics are right brain. More musicians are right brain. Singers, dancers, artists. We were just having this conversation off air, Anna and I were, about the difference between ghost and the soul. And also, I was explaining the difference about, I'm a psychic. I'm a stadium-sized psychic for illustration purposes, and I'm only a football-sized medium. And what I described with mediumship is you have to achieve the state of consciousness you literally just described in order to purely connect with the spirit on the other side, a soul on the other side that wants to come back and communicate with somebody over here.
Yeah.
And psychic, you don't have to do as much work. It's just more an innate, immediate frequency around a person. But the dead people, you got to sort of reach out there and summon them over. And then you've got to get your AM staticky signal higher so that you're in tune with the frequency you're describing, Grant.
Yeah.
But before I forget, now this is a fast-moving interview. But I want to ask you about two questions. One, are you still a big Edgar Cayce fan?
I'm very familiar with this stuff. I don't have much time to research it anymore, but from time to time, stuff will pop up into my head, things that I remember him saying, because at the time I studied all the readings. I was very much into it.
Yes.
And certain things that, like the one that always pops into my head is when I'm talking to experiencers, people who are UFO experiencers, sometimes they'll whine and complain about the situation in life. And I always say to them, you got to realize, if you understand the UFO thing, it ties into reality, about what reality is all about. You're playing in the most important game of all times. You're playing in the Super Bowl, and you got to realize that you're in this game. You could have been like an untouchable in the streets of Calcutta, and you got chosen to play this game, that you're playing this thing, and you're raising consciousness in the world and stuff like that. You better realize you're in the Super Bowl and start to play. And that's when this thing always pops into my mind about Edgar Cayce, who said, knowledge not used is sin. In the Bible, it says, to whom much is given, much is expected. Yeah. So whatever your talent is, you're actually worse off if you have a lot of information about how all this stuff works and you don't do anything with it, rather than somebody who's stupid and on the street who really doesn't really need to know any of this kind of stuff. We have a lot of responsibility with the information that we've sort of been given. And I sort of look at experiencers, I look at psychics, I look at all these people as high-end spirits. I don't believe that you come into the world and you learn this kind of stuff. I think it's the multiple life type thing. Yeah. And that comes into ufology, that I say when I made the move from nuts and bolts to consciousness, one of the key things that I always point out to people is if you get one single UFO case that can be tracked back before birth, and I always tell the story about the Moody Blues, the band the Moody Blues. If you get one case that goes back before birth, it all changes. It's got nothing to do with free energy. It's got nothing to do with what metal it is, where they're from, who cares. It's got to do with a spiritual thing. If it goes past multiple lives, it's a spiritual problem.
Well, and Edgar Cayce was one of the most famous psychics in the whole world, but he has had a great gift of going literally into this unconscious state and tuning into the higher consciousness. And he's the first person under the religious umbrella, by the way, who started speaking about reincarnation.
Exactly.
And how that affects us in this lifetime. Now, he also predicted when he would be reincarnated back into the earth plane after his death. Now, and he's going to be reincarnated somewhere in the Midwest and in our lifetime. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with it. I'm also familiar with the fact that he said that the guys that would meet with him would have glasses, and there would be a cigar-shaped craft which didn't make any noise.
Oh yeah,
and that's back in the whenever it was, the 1930s or whatever, that he described. This is before UFOs even appeared on the scene.
Man, see, I'm fascinated with this. I wanted to ask you. We want to ask you about your book that's just been released, the Alien Bedtime Story book.
That's a great title.
Yeah,
It didn't work out very well though. It was a nice title, and I've got these two kids on the cover where the mother's reading them these bedtime stories, and these two kids are half Tibetan and half Aboriginal. But what happened with it was everybody thinks it's kids' bedtime stories, and it's not. What happened was I wrote the UFOs, Area 51, and government informants, and it's like a Richard Dolan type book. It's a very historic book. It talks about the cover up and who's in all this stuff. And all my friends and relatives that bought the book to support me or whatever said, I was trying to read it. I read 3 pages a night, but I keep forgetting where I am, and it's like this long involved story. So I said, well, let's just cut all these stories into little bedtime stories. We're going to read one every night, and that's why I called it Alien Bedtime Stories. And it sort of backfired because everybody thinks even Amazon had it in the kids' book section. and what it is just I take like a story from each president. Like each president has a story that's related to them involved with UFOs, and I'll put one story from each president. And I do a couple of consciousness ones in there. I do a couple from the Canadian government. I do a couple of the sightings. I tell the story in when I had my own sightings, the time I was going to jump on the craft, which was kind of a famous story here, where I had one of these orb type objects where I actually managed to sneak up on one of these things, and I was so close that I had an 8mm movie camera running, and I told my friend who was with me, I said, hold on to the camera, I'm going to jump on this thing. And I was just about to run, and because I was like the doubting Thomas. I had seen it, I was that close, I could see it, but it was still like, I've got to touch it. I mean, I knew I could get burned, something might happen, but I had to touch it. And then he said, well, hang on. He said, I think there's one sitting on top of the car. And I said, what? Because we'd got out of the car and we'd sort of walked to this bridge where this thing was sitting. We'd come to the bridge twice, and it had disappeared below the bridge. But the third time we walked instead of driving the car, and that's when I was like 50 feet away from this thing, and it was right there, and I could see it clear as day. And then we turned around, and it looked like the moon, and looking into the north, it looked like the moon or the sun rising in the north above the car, and this orange half sphere on top of the car, and this orange smoke hanging down at the side of the car. And I went, oh, let's run. And I started to run towards the car, and I turned around. Of course, the one who was at the bridge was gone. And when I got back to the car, I tried to talk my friend into going back again. I said, it's back in the bridge. Let's go. I want to touch this thing. I want to jump on it. And he said, no, I want to. And it was his car, and we had this big fight, and he ended up winning. He said, no, I'm not going back. I'm not going back. And so we left. And I tell that story, and I show a few of the photographs of this object that we had on the ground and stuff that we were investigating. So that's what the book is. It's just a whole pile of sort of interesting stories. The most popular story ever on my website was a story about some deers that got hit outside my city, and they got flipped up onto this, I don't know how it happened, but they ended up on this hydro line, up 50 feet up on this hydro line or whatever it is, 40 feet up in the air, and the legs, the feet were missing off this deer. And I remember when I put that story on, it was the old story where you think you've got a UFO story, it's really important, you put it up and nobody reads it. And this one, I could not kill the story. It was all over the place, and it had the most traffic of any story I ever had on my website.
Wow.
And it had nothing to do with UFOs.
Well, one thing that you do, and most people that are in the ufology, there's sometimes men in black, and especially you dealing with a lot of presidential sightings and their verbiage of sightings. Or in fact, I'm going to play one thing that I'm sure you've heard before, and for our listeners.
Oh yes, we discussed it at every conference that we had with the military. There's always things like that going on, flying saucers, and they've had other things,
And that was Harry Truman, and that was when you were talking about in 1952. So when you started doing research with the presidents, who did you start with? Was it with Truman?
Yeah, it was true with Truman through the Eisenhower the Walker files. Then it went to Eisenhower, and then of course I went after the big one, which was Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter was sort of public that he had one sighting, and I found out he actually had two. There was another one that happened in Panama, and it actually has a photograph involved with it,
Really?
where he's leaving on a helicopter, and one of the people on the ground gets this photograph of this UFO by the helicopter, and it's pretty clear. It doesn't really look. It looks like a UFO with a big halo around it. It's a really weird looking thing. But so that's in the library, and actually, like most people think that the government's sort of covering up, and in the presidential libraries, there's no cover up taking place, because the guys that are there are just historians. They're people who like documents and stuff. And in fact, the guy at the Carter Library, we were in the Carter Library 2 hours after the Carter Library closed, and he was just fascinated because he had gone to school with Chip Carter, Jimmy Carter's son, and he had heard the story about Jimmy Carter with the UFO, and he said the date is wrong. He said he figured it was 1967 when this happened, because he remembered being in school with Chip Carter and hearing the story, and so he was very interested in the UFO phenomena, and he would actually provide me stuff. He would find stuff, and he would send me stuff. For example, Eric Gary, who was the Prime Minister of Grenada, this famous story that he had come to the White House, and he had had a UFO sighting. He was very involved. He was actually a contactee, and he's the guy that was at the United Nations who would put the thing in front of the United Nations to study UFOs. And while he was there at the United Nations, his country was overthrown by the communists, and he was at the Carter White House. He met with Jimmy Carter, and of course it was well known that both of them were into UFOs. So I was trying to find all the documents that in this meeting, what they had talked about in the meeting, and it was actually the archivist, without me even asking for it, who suddenly one day sent me the handwritten notes from Jimmy Carter talking about what had been discussed at the meeting. And two of the things were, one was UFOs, and one was it voodooism, or it was something like that, something really weird that they were talking about, like non-local type reality. So, and it was actually Jimmy Carter's handwriting. So it was that kind of stuff where I got into trying to find the interesting things, like the other interesting thing I really got was the Ronald Reagan. It was one of these synchronicity type things where I'm at the Ronald Reagan Library, and I'm studying the speech where he makes the speech about how the world would unite if faced with a threat from an alien race, which is actually the concept that the aliens are trying to get across to us. The fact that the oneness, the left brain believes in ego, it believes in separation, it believes in we're all individuals, it's survival of the fittest, you versus me, good versus bad, all this kind of stuff. And the right brain believes in oneness. It believes that everything's connected. And so this is one of the sort of the messages Ronald Reagan was putting out, how we're all one. If we realized what was going on, we'd all come together as one, and we'd realize that we're humans on Earth and not individual people. And so when I'm looking there, I'm studying this speech, and it was like 5 minutes before the library closed. The last day I was there, I was in Los Angeles for about a week, and it was 5 minutes before the library closed, and I'm looking through some of the documents, and I said, "Is this Ronald Reagan's handwriting?" And she said, "No, that's not it." And she flips through the document, and she says, "There's Ronald Reagan's handwriting," and it was Ronald Reagan talking about the alien invasion. They had pulled it out of the 1987 United Nations speech, and he had said, "I would like my fantasy put back in, how the world would unite if faced with visitors from another planet," or something like that. And it was Ronald Reagan's handwriting. I went, wow. I mean, just the weird synchronicity of 5 minutes before, this woman pointing this out. So I made that sort of public, and it was those kind of things that, when it came to the presidential stuff, that really sort of sealed it for me, that because a lot of the times in the presidential libraries, it was basically I'd be through the documents in 15 minutes, and the rest of the week I would sit there and read oral histories from people, just wasting my time because there was nothing to read. There are no real documents in the presidential libraries, UFO documents.
Well, I wanted to actually play another one, and that was President Reagan.
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held. If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe, we'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
How powerful is that?
Yeah, and that's the key message that the aliens, I believe, are trying to get across, this oneness message, that everything is connected, everything is one. And you find this when you get into the real right brain stuff, like the very heavy psychedelic experiences where you have high doses of LSD or something like that in these lab experiments where it kills the ego, where the first thing the person realizes is that everything's connected, that everything is alive, everything's connected. There's a couple of Ronald Reagan ones that you may not have that I can just quickly mention. One was that this came from Shirley MacLaine. I got it confirmed through.
Yep.
What's that?
Yes, I know.
Yeah, this is the one
Eddie
where
was there.
He has the sighting coming from Sacramento, going to a cocktail party in Los Angeles, and during when he arrives, Steve Martin talked about it. I had that, and Lucille Ball talks about it in her autobiography, where she says, I always wondered whether people would have voted for Ronald Reagan if they had known about him having this UFO sighting. What she told Shirley MacLaine was that it wasn't just a UFO sighting. Lucille Ball said that Reagan had actually encountered an alien. It had landed, and everybody else tells the story. When he got there, he was really excited when he came into this cocktail party, and that the alien had actually told him to run for president, and that's why he was so fascinated. And the other story that a lot of people don't know is a story about Steven Spielberg, that people always say, when the president stands up and says UFOs are real, then I'll believe it. Well, Ronald Reagan stood up and said it was for real, and everybody ignored him. It happened in June of 1982. Steven Spielberg's at the White House, and he's screening E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And there's two different stories. One is told, Steven Spielberg tells to a film producer by the name of Jamie Chandray in Japan, that at the end of the speech, or just at the end of the movie, just as it was ending, Ronald Reagan was sitting beside Steven Spielberg, and he said, I bet you there aren't 6 people in this room that know that how true this all is. And at the end, I have Steven Spielberg actually saying on an audio where he says, Ronald Reagan stood up at the end of the speech, and he looked around the room as if he was doing a head count. And he said, Stephen, I'd like to thank you for bringing E.T. to the White House. And I'd just like to let you know there are only a handful of people in this room that know that everything on that screen is absolutely true.
That's right.
And he said it without a smile.
Yay!
So there's these kind of stories behind the scenes where you hear, presidents actually confirming this. I believe all presidents know. Even Jimmy Carter, who people think didn't know, told Shirley MacLaine that he had tried to open up the channels, the intelligence channels, and he was going to test to see how this would play with the people, but that he couldn't and wouldn't. But she said that he had actually proposed that he was going to release this kind of stuff to the public. But and it comes down to this classification thing, like what happened with when I talked to Dick Cheney. It all has to do with weapons. If the U.S. military is very left-brained. They're very into self. It's everything is black, white, good, evil. We're the good guys on the hill. We're not going to give this to the bad guys. There's evil people. There's the Mexicans are evil, and the Japanese were evil, and
the gay people are evil.
Gay people, everybody, the blacks, you go through this whole scenario. So of course, if you're the U.S. military, we're the good guys, and we're not going to give this up. And that's what Dick Cheney had said when I asked him. And that's what I always tell people. If you ever get a 4-star general who has a unified command, that person will know everything. Or if you get a president or a vice president, what you want to ask him is not, do you believe in UFOs? Or what do you think about UFOs? Because they'll just walk around the question. What you want to ask him is the briefing question. And the truth of the whole situation is done in a briefing. Someone will come into your office, they'll sign you to a secrecy oath, and then they will brief you. And presidents and vice presidents are briefed on certain subjects. And so I asked Dick Cheney, I said, in all your jobs in government, and he was chief of staff for President Gerald Ford. He was Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr. And when I talked to him, he was in the White House. I said, in all your jobs in government, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? If so, when was it and what were you told? And he paused and he said, if I had been briefed on that subject, it would probably be classified and I wouldn't be talking about it. And that's what I believe is what it comes down to in the cover-up is the president knows, but he's sworn to secrecy like everybody else. And if you get him like Barack Obama, he's trying to leak stuff out.
Yes,
he's
yes.
trying to play with the subject, but he's sworn to secrecy like everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, the time is up, and you're going to have to come back because we're just touching the surface. But at the end of May, you're going to be at Contact in the Desert.
Yeah.
So what are you going to be talking about there? Similar stuff?
I'm doing the consciousness, and I'm going to do the whole connection to the cure for cancer, which I think is pretty important because people always say, well, link this into something that means something. And I say, okay, here we go. We've had the cure to cancer for a number of years. I'll show the stats and how it works in the right brain, left brain thing and link it into consciousness. The only problem is I'm up against Eric Von Doniken. He's in the other theater. So a lot of people aren't going to be coming to watch me.
But listen, but will they be recording it so that people can get it later?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's a pretty well-run operation there. So I'm doing that, but I'm getting more into the stuff about why are all implants on the left side of the body? How do aliens put in implants without leaving scars? And some of this stuff, I think I have the answer to this kind of stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that I haven't really discussed in public, and I'm going to go through that kind of stuff.
Awesome.
That's
Thank you,
great.
Grant. And your just released book is called The Alien Bedtime Storybook. And then you're also preparing...
Not for children.
Not for
Not
children.
for children.
And then you're also preparing to release inspirations and downloads where good ideas come from.
And that will be my most important work by far.
Perfect.
I can't wait. I'm going to get it.
Okay.
And we
I
are
appreciate
to
it.
presidentialufo.com and go to Amazon, pick all these books. And that is Grant Cameron. Thank you, sir. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for your interest.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I still think Eddie should do a Unlock the Universe, unless you just don't feel like it, Eddie.
I can do it.
All right. So we're going to take about 30-second break, and then we're coming back with Unlock the Universe Within with Eddie Connor. Be right back.